My name is Jennifer D. Mudd, and I am the Executive Director of the Manufacturing Growth Alliance, also known as MGA. We are a membership-based organization that provides services to help manufacturers build smart, lead strong, and establish a pathway for future growth. Our services drive solutions that make manufacturing in Michigan the most competitive and prosperous in the nation. COVID-19 has elevated the role of human resources in a manufacturing facility, whether it's compliance with COVID guidelines, supporting employees with their challenges, or needed shifts in communication channels. The function of human resources is needed now more than ever. Today, we're going to hear from Axios HR professionals as they answer some of the consistent questions being asked related to COVID-19 in the workplace. Before I introduce our guests, I have a few housekeeping items I'd like to share with you. Again, we encourage questions and comments. Please place them in the chat box. I will be monitoring that chat box as we have our conversation today, and we will be sure to answer all the questions. If we can't get to them in the time allotted, we will circle back to you to respond to those questions. We are recording the conversation, so we can provide this to you so you can share, as well as we'd like to provide this to other manufacturers so that they can have some of their questions answered. So now we get to introduce our guest today. Kelly Haynes is the president of Axios HR. She is an expert in human resources and has built a company that truly embraces serving small businesses. Also joining us is John Sanford. John is a human resource and management consultant at Axios HR. He has been with Axios for 15 years. Let's welcome Kelly and John.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for having us, Jennifer. We really do appreciate it. And I'm going to start with just a little bit about what's going to happen today and what we're going to talk about, and then talk a little bit about us. So we're going to start with a bit about who we are at Axios, and we're going to talk about some issues related to COVID-19, in particular the vaccine, but we're happy to answer any questions. This past year has been a whirlwind for human resources and everyone. Talk a little bit about compliance, incentives, employee time off, tax credits, etc. We want this to be an interactive session, so we've come up with a format of probably some of the most frequent questions that we have, and John's going to go through those. But we really do want to make sure that we answer all your questions. So if you have more, please send them to us. So just a little bit about us. Axios HR is a human resource company. We work with primarily small businesses, people that have under primarily 100 to 150 employees, as small as 2 employees up to maybe about 150. And we do everything HR. Jennifer said that I have expertise in HR. I'd say I have a thimbleful of expertise in HR, but we have a wonderful team such as John and others that have the wealth of experience and human resources. So our core purpose of Axios HR is to be vested in making a difference. That's vested in making a difference in our business owners' lives, to make their lives a little bit easier so they don't have to worry about these HR issues, making a difference in all the employees who work for all these wonderful companies that we serve, and then ultimately making a difference in the community. We like to say that we're innovative, so we're looking at always having different human resource and employee experience through technology. We also are very focused on making things simple. We don't want to make HR complicated. We want to make it simple for business owners, simple for management, and simple for the employees. And above all, we believe the word human in human resources really does make a difference. And we try to customize all of our solutions in a human way that's going to work for the organization. So a little bit more, we've been in business for over 30 years. I've been with the company for 29 years. We serve over 500 companies, all pretty much headquartered in Michigan, a lot in Western Michigan, but we're all over the state of Michigan. We are 100% employee owned, so we're all owners here, which is a wonderful thing for us. Our teams do take a personal interest in your success, listening to our customers' needs and delivering great human resource solutions. And we really do empower our employees internally, our fellow owners, to really take a collaborative approach and innovative approach to human resources. So the next thing is just a little bit about, again, today, I have just a couple comments in relation to COVID-19 and being a business and human resources helping our clients. But I can tell you that obviously the past year has been a whirlwind. New regulations coming almost every other day, in some cases, maybe every day. And people like John in our organization and many others, I can tell you, spent hours upon hours researching information and then educating our clients on what all these regulations mean, what the changes mean, how do they implement that at their organization. One example is we had to do a readiness plan that came, I don't even know what month last year, but we did all those plans for all of our clients and got them implemented. So it's been a crazy year for human resources. I say that I've gotten, and our team has really gotten a PhD in human resource compliance related to pandemics, and it's been crazy. And now as we move to getting somewhat back to normalcy, we have a lot of our manufacturers remained open all through the emergency orders. So there was a lot of hands-on work that needed to be done to make sure that the facilities were safe and compliant, et cetera. So our team's really done a great job with that. And now we're moving into kind of the vaccine stage, which is really what our main focus of today is. But again, we're willing to answer whatever we can. So one, I just want to say I appreciate you taking a few minutes to be on this webinar with us and listening to us. And now I'm going to kick it over to really John Sanford, who is the senior HR consultant for us in our organization and has so much knowledge that I can't believe he can hold it all in that massive brain of his, but we really do appreciate it. So John, with that, I send it to you.
Well, thank you, Kelly. Luckily, a low bar for me to get over. So, and despite what feels like the PhD in COVID that an awful lot of us have gotten, I am not a lawyer. I do not give specific legal advice. Your mileage may vary, and I didn't sleep in a Holiday Inn Express last night. So, but we're going to try to give you what we would call really operational, tactical, hands-on help with the day-to-day questions that you're getting, from your staff, your managers, and wondering yourself for your business, how do we continue to move things forward? So hopefully we'll give you some insight on that. And if you have further questions that don't get answered in this, as Jen mentioned, again, put those in the chat. We're going to try to make sure we set aside some time here at the end of the session to answer as many as we can. So the first one, it's kind of that big one that most people put out there is, can I make everybody get vaccinated? Can I mandate it in my organization? The short answer is yes. And then the lawyerly answer is it depends. You can certainly mandate it. You can certainly require it. I think what most employers, both large and small, are doing as a best practice is really, recommending to their staff to get vaccinated, trying to create ways to make it easy for them to get vaccinated, but going short of actually mandating it. Even when you mandate a vaccine in a workplace, be it flu or other things, especially you see that in medical settings where various vaccinations are required to work in a doctor's office or a hospital, or in fact, even in some schools and preschool settings, that there are exceptions to that rule. A couple different things will impact that. One is the ADA, the Americans with Disabilities Act. Somebody that has a health situation that might be exacerbated by a vaccine can ask for an exception or an accommodation to not get that vaccine. At that point, you really have to go into what's called an interactive process and look at, okay, I'm creating this requirement for vaccination because of A. If this person doesn't do that, how does it impact my business? Does it create a threat within my workforce? Or does it create a threat for that person because of the kind of work they do? Might it actually harm them? The thing I always try to make sure people remember that when you're looking at general safety in any workplace is the general duty clause. Under both OSHA and MyOSHA, every employer has a general duty to provide a safe workplace. And that can be things from ergonomics to safety on the plant floor to providing safety from a plague, essentially, that has infected the entire planet at this point. And so that general duty clause really kind of covers everything. And then within that, we get a lot of guidelines and guidance from MIOSHA, the CDC, and all these other areas. So can you make that mandatory within your group? Absolutely, you can. But again, you have to know that there are no absolutes and that there can be exceptions that need to be evaluated. The other primary exception out there is for religious reasons. Any sincerely held religious belief that for whatever reason it might be under that religious belief that taking in medicine or a vaccine or something that's been biologically or genetically created goes against their religious beliefs would be another exception. And again, at that time, you'd really have to get into an accommodation discussion of, can we accommodate this or not? So I think what we're seeing again in that best practice out there from groups is really highly recommending to staff to get vaccinated and trying to create some programs around that to assist with that. And we'll talk about that in a little more detail here. And I think a question just down the road. So once people do get vaccinated, what are some of the changes we're going to see in the workplace? Quite honestly, quite a lot fewer than you'd probably think. Even when somebody gets vaccinated, when you look at the current MIOSHA rules that are in place, the rules that have been in place since October, they were just extended last week until October of this year. Those rules don't change. There's actually no language in there that makes any differentiation between somebody in your workplace who's been vaccinated or not been vaccinated. When it comes to somebody in your workplace potentially becoming infected and having to do notification to information to other employees who might have had close contact, the CDC guidelines around that allow you to, at that point, not have to do the close contact notification to people who are vaccinated. So if you are able to, at that point, know who the person's been in close contact, if you have a listing of people who have been vaccinated, we'll get into kind of the tracking of that here in a little bit. At that point, those people do not have to be contacted like they would today if they have not been vaccinated or over the past 12 months or so. So very few changes really. Distancing, safeguards, wearing masks, all those rules would stay in place based on the current legislation that's in place and the current emergency rules that are in place through MIOSHA. So what if my folks don't want to get vaccinated and I'm mandating it, we'll assume, can I let them go? Well, as we talked about a little bit before, ultimately the answer to that would be yes, but there is also, like any separation, a process that you'd have to go through. Again, when you look at both religious and or ADA accommodations, there may be something there that you need to have a further discussion about and see, is there something here that I need to be accommodating before I'm making a separation decision? I think the bigger picture that we've talked about with most of our employers that have concerns around these areas is, especially in the area of staffing, is, what do you think the fallout is going to be of this kind of a program or this kind of a stance? Right now, finding skilled technical people is very, very hard to do. We know there's going to be a certain amount of the population, and the estimates are going to be anywhere from 20 to 30% that either are not going to get vaccinated because they just don't want to, or because they have legitimate reasons that they feel they're not going to get vaccinated. So there's going to be a certain part of the population out there, and if you figure you can apply those percentages to any workforce, can you as an employer and as an organization afford to lose potentially 20 or 30% of your workforce? So I think, again, we often try to jump to what's the end game, in any of these kind of situations. And we want to be thinking about that. We want to make sure we don't miss some of those intermediate steps we need to take before we get to that kind of a decision. So while the ultimate, answer to that would be yes, there's a lot of steps you want to make sure you're taking in between there and then, and also be thinking again from an organizational standpoint, is this the right stance to take within my organization? A lot of times it really feels like it does, feels very strong, like I'm doing the best I can to protect all of my employees, as best I can. And that's not the wrong way to think, but the actions that come out of that could be detrimental to the organization overall. So you want to be really measured in how you take an approach to that.
John, could I just jump in here really quick and add just one quick thing is, as John has said, technically you could say yes, we're an at-will employer, so you can terminate a person for almost anything. You just have to weigh as a business owner, what are those risks? And It's yet to be seen of whether, and probably will at some point go through court cases. If someone refuses to get vaccinated, they get terminated, they sue for wrongful discharge. Ultimately, there might be some case law that will decide that. But what you have to weigh, and what I weigh all the time, is what's the cost of that litigation? And I can tell you, being in human resources, we often recommend to our clients and go through the cost of litigation on something on a what if far outweighs probably a better policy of making it a voluntary thing and giving people potentially incentives or that type of thing.
Okay. Question number 4. This is kind of one of the magic questions we're hearing here, especially in the last week or so. Can the employer make employees come into the office? So you're really thinking about your office admin staff, professional staff, etc. Right now, the current guidelines under the MIOSHA emergency rules are that, to quote, the employer shall create a policy of prohibiting in-person work for employees to the extent that their work activities can feasibly be completed remotely. What a bunch of gobbledygook, right? So feasibly, define that for yourself. It's never been truly laid out. What MIOSHA is really looking for in these situations, based on the further guidance they've given, is they want to make sure that as part of your COVID plan, which you should have in place and have documented and have it available to your employees, is that if you're requiring employees to come in, or if they are actually coming in to work voluntarily because they want to get out of the house and your coffee's better than what they have at home, that you have looked at their position, you've looked at the workplace, and you've made sure it can be as safe as possible. If you're specifically requiring somebody to come into work, that you've looked at that particular work that's being done and made an assessment based on the job, the role, the task, the interaction with other staff, etc., that it's truly necessary for that role to be on site and be working around potentially other employees. Now, if you're small enough and you've got one person who's coming in and that's it, they're kind of considered that essential employee that's coming in to make sure things get done on site, you're probably in good shape with that. And what MIOSHA, again, is really looking for is process. That you've made some effort, then they don't even have to agree with it. And they've been pretty clear with that, is that if you've at least gone through a process and assessed the role, assessed the job, and said, can this person come into work, and should they come into work, they're okay with that. Even if they don't agree with you, they'll go like, okay, you've at least looked at it and you've made some decisions around some analysis. That's great. Maybe we disagree with it. We can talk about that. But if you've at least done that, you've kind of got over that first hurdle and can then have a conversation about it. If you haven't done that due diligence piece in the process, that's where you're really going to find yourself in trouble. At that point, it's basically a negligent move, and MIOSHA's thought is that you haven't done the steps, you haven't done the work that needed to have that person be required to come into work. And from there, that's where some of the fines start to happen and they can start to pile up. The federal government's also looking into these kinds of situations. I know there was I believe it was an electrical contractor out on the East Coast, and I think there were about 150, 160 employees. And a number of office folks. The fine, I think, that I saw listed for them was somewhere north of $100,000. That will, of course, get negotiated down and appealed, and et cetera, et cetera. But to Kelly's point, by the time you get done going through that kind of process, paying your attorneys and everything else to get that cut in half, you've probably spent that much with the attorneys. Maybe you think that's a fair shake, yeah, or more, as Kelly is mouthing there. It's just going to create focus and distractions for you that you don't want to have. So again, you really want to make sure that you're having discussions with people before you really are requiring them to come into the office. And I think what we're seeing in an awful lot of workplaces, people want to come back. So are you doing and taking those steps to make sure that they can, in fact, return safely? Okay. Questions about vaccinations. What can we talk about? Okay, can I ask people if they've been vaccinated? What are some of the guidelines around this? You can absolutely ask if people have been vaccinated. That is fine. And then that's quite honestly about where you want to stop. If they've been vaccinated, probably the only follow-up question you want to do is, did they get a 1 or 2 dose? And how far past that last dose are they? Because again, the general consensus is you need to be at least 2 weeks past that final dose of whatever kind of vaccine you've gotten to be fully vaccinated. At that point, you can say, yes, I'm done, I'm free, and I'm good to go from there. So those are really about as far as you want to go as far as asking questions. Now, if you're doing some sort of incentive program, other things which we'll talk about in a little bit here, you can maybe get a little more detail than that. But quite honestly, you don't want to know too much more than that. You do start to get into some of the HIPAA privacy issues. If you go beyond into other questions, you start getting into GINA questions, which is the genetic safety and privacy piece that's out there at the federal government level. And you don't want to get too much more information than that. Can I do anything to incent employees to get vaccinated? Yeah, well, you can. From a general incentive standpoint, usually the things most people think about are, gifts or prizes or actual cash compensation. Very similar to the rules around any kind of gift items or compensation that you might give to an employee. The IRS and the Department of Labor look at that as what they would call a de minimis rule. It has to be pretty minimal. Some examples they've given are maybe the time off to go get vaccinated, maybe a water bottle or some other, fairly small kind of gift item. I know we've had some clients talk about doing much larger, cash incentives to do that. And I think to Kelly's point earlier, again, there's certainly risk once you go past a certain line with that. And quite honestly, the risk doesn't come from you actually doing it. It's from the people who aren't going to get the incentive. If you have somebody who's saying, based on religious grounds, I'm not getting vaccinated, and now I'm missing out on this benefit, which if it's substantial enough, for some people, they would think $100 is substantial, or maybe it's $500. At that point, they're being denied a benefit because of their religious beliefs, not so much because they're getting vaccinated. All these things start to tie together. So you do have to be really careful. And there are some options around the FFCRA that can provide time for people to get vaccinated as well. Paid time, and we'll talk about that a little bit as well. So unless you're keeping it very, very simple, very small, could even be a gift card for a coffee, again, water bottle, very kind of de minimis type items, you'll be in good shape if you're doing those things to incent people. What you don't want to do is create a wellness program or a benefit program, which ultimately is what happens with that. If you think a lot of times we run into these kind of situations, especially around the holidays, where you're doing gift items for people or doing Thanksgiving turkeys and things like that, even those items start to creep up against that de minimis threshold there for both the Department of Labor and the IRS. So you just want to be really careful. Okay. Is MIOSHA providing additional guidance? Well, they are. In fact, at this point, what we've seen in the emergency rules that are out there outside of the office workplace rules are the extension of the current rules and an awful lot of other tools as well. So specifically on the manufacturing side, they've created some tools. I believe there's a guide that I actually was looking at here a couple of days ago. It's about 34 pages for manufacturing sites to help you kind of navigate both what am I doing for my COVID plan, which again, you should and need to have, and really should have had probably about 12 months ago, a documented COVID plan to help you guide your business day to day around these COVID issues. The MIOSHA website actually has a draft of that plan. It's free of charge, your tax dollars at work. It's a Word document. You can download it, fill in the blanks where you need to, put your logo on it, and you now have COVID plans. So if you don't have one, make sure you're getting on top of that. As Kelly mentioned, we helped most all of our clients do that about 12 months or so ago now. And then the other guidance is really industry specific. Currently, under the emergency rules, specifically with manufacturers are currently required to create dedicated entry points at every facility for daily screening and ensure physical barriers are in place to prevent anyone from bypassing that screening. So especially if you're a mid-sized, larger employer, a lot of times you might have multiple entryways and doorways where people kind of come and go, especially shipping bays and things like that. People just kind of come and go when shifts change, et cetera. The rules essentially state that you have to narrow that down to one point of entry, create barriers from people going in and out other doors, and make sure you're doing that employee screening process. The employee screening process is required of all employees. So whether somebody's coming in the front door into the lobby or into the back door of the plant, there should be some sort of screening process. So that's consistent. And then the other is creating protocols for minimizing any kind of personal contact around delivery of materials into the facility. That one's fairly straightforward. But again, if you've got somebody who needs to sign off on a delivery, et cetera, you're supposed to be able to minimize that contact. Unfortunately, the coffee pot for the drivers probably needs to go away or be someplace away from your employees so that people aren't mingling around that. Now, the MIOSHA agency has actually put out for review draft permanent rules. So right now we are working under emergency rules. Those emergency rules were put in place last October and they were just extended last week for another 6 months. MIOSHA has determined and feels that they need to have emergency rules in place for a longer period. They don't feel by this October that we're going to be out of the woods yet. So they have drafted ongoing rules that would be in place permanently as part of the normal OSHA rules. So if you think about the rules you follow right now for your high-low that are mandated by OSHA, these are going to be the mandated rules permanently in place by OSHA for COVID. And hopefully what we'll see is some changes during the comment period, which should lead up to a May 26th hearing in Lansing. And we can send you some additional information if you're interested in that. The proposed rules are actually a little less strict than what are in place now. So as I just mentioned, specific to the manufacturing piece, having that dedicated screening place and creating barriers to people coming and going, that part actually goes away. The only requirement they're having for manufacturers that are different from other employers is minimizing contact during delivery of materials. That's the only differentiating point for manufacturers under the proposed rules. So they're actually less strict than what they are today under the emergency rules. So it is nice to see that they are doing some things that say, okay, you know, employers and manufacturers, we think you've got this, please be smart. Follow at least the basics. We'll take some of these more strict things out of here and let you become a little more flexible in your operations. So that is a good sign. And I think obviously they've heard some of the feedback that's come from a lot of different organizations in these kind of areas. But what we're also going to be looking at is right now, there doesn't seem to be any timeline. There's no sunsetting in these proposed rules. At some point, you know, all things willing, knock on wood, COVID will be a thing of the past. And at least even if it's a couple of years from now, having these rules in place as a permanent part of the rules may not make a ton of sense. So we're thinking that they may actually convert this into potentially an infectious disease type rule, so that if we do have a future issue, the rules are already in place and we'll kind of know what to do and not have to start from scratch. The other piece that comes around this with the MIOSHA is that back in January, President Biden directed OSHA, the federal agency, to create rules by March 15th. It is April 22nd, and we have seen no such rules at this point, but we know they're being worked on. So if the federal rules come out before the Michigan rules are finalized, it could be that the state of Michigan and MIOSHA just goes, we're fine with those. We're just going to adopt that and move on. So the federal rules become the law of the land. We go with that. The state of Virginia right now is actually the only state in the nation that has permanent COVID rules in place. And they're actually modeled, quite honestly, on Michigan's rules. We were one of the first ones to put emergency rules in place, and they just adopted them as permanent back quite a while ago. The federal government is looking to model theirs potentially on Virginia, so we may see something fairly similar. Again, a process, it has to be played out, but we are in the middle of a comment period. So I know a lot of organizations and industry associations are providing that kind of feedback robustly to the individuals who will be looking at these rules and hopefully making some adjustments to them as we go forward. So what will change about the office environment as workers return? Well, I think the key thing is going to be, especially if they've primarily been working from home, and again, we have quite a lot of hybrid workplaces right now where people are coming, going, or half the team's coming in on a schedule, half the team's going out, is going to be that the rules for right now, at least through October, are not going to change very much. Again, the vaccination piece really only changes notification rules for the most part if there's been close contact with somebody who has either been positive or has symptoms. Again, if you've been vaccinated at that point, you no longer have to be on that notification list. Though quite honestly, in a small organization, if somebody goes home sick or you know, potentially has COVID or is going to get tested, more than likely the bulk of your staff's going to find out on Facebook that night, if they didn't find out already when that person didn't show up that day or left at lunch. I think that's what we've seen in a lot of the organizations we work with. Unfortunately, the grapevine is faster than email on almost any given day. So for folks working in offices, we're not going to see a lot of change. We are going to have to continue to look at spacing, making sure that social distance spacing is in place, that people are being provided and using proper face masks, and they have proper sanitation devices around them as well, be it sanitizer or frequent hand washing reminders. So unfortunately, in the short term, not a lot of change for folks who are working in the office. The other piece that's potentially changing, though, under the longer term rules, the work at home rules actually are staying in place. The language hasn't changed much, but it did actually, after the can feasibly language said, for reasons of technical, economical, or performance issues, if it can be completed remotely. So MIOSHA is trying to provide at least a little bit of guidance in this area where, from a technical standpoint, if somebody struggles working from home, then, you know, obviously they could come in. That could certainly be one of those reasons. And that's probably the #1 reason we hear of people coming into the office. They're like, my home office setup is not a home office, it's a kitchen table. My internet, you know, service is not reliable. All those are the reasons that we've all heard over the last 12 months. Economical reasons. Again, if it's truly hurting your business not to have somebody in the office, or maybe sales are waning because they're not focused on sales, et cetera, things like that, that could be a reason to require somebody to come back into the office. And performance. Okay, performance is a huge umbrella. There's so many things that could fall under performance. Could be internal communications. It could be outreach to clients and customers. It could be internal communications with team members, especially when you look at groups like engineering and CAD and production. Having those people in one place to collaborate is so important. And when those folks are off-site, things get dropped, things get missed when you can't look people in the eyes and talk with them, even if it is looking them in the eyes from 6 feet away. That personal connection is really important. So again, I think MIOSHA is trying to take some of those things into consideration, and hopefully we'll see again even a little more flexibility in that as the rules develop before they become finalized. So if I have employees off due to COVID or the side effects of a vaccine, are the tax credits still available to pay them? Yes, they are. The FFCRA, the Families First Coronavirus Response Act, and the American Recovery Plan Act. We love our acronyms in HR, let me tell you. And we love the tongue twisting it does to us as well. Those programs are still in place and still available. Now, the question is, are you participating or not? Back in January, they were extended past their initial deadline for a 3-month period through the end of March, and then they were extended again under ARPA. Now, at both of those time periods, you had that option to say, do I want to continue to participate in this? And it's essentially a yes or no. It's not based on per person or who walked in that day sick or not. It's, am I participating or not? And then you go forward from there. In general, we tend to consider it a best practice to participate. If somebody truly is sick, or they're sick due to the vaccine, or they've got daycare issues, we know that schools are opening and closing and opening. There's still a lot of daycare issues, a very large shortage of daycare out there for those with younger children who need care. To be able to provide some sort of benefit and be able to receive the tax credit back as an organization. Again, that's a finance and accounting side. I could probably even let Kelly talk a little more about the specifics of that if we need to get into it. Not the finance guru, but I know some. And if you have further questions, we can get into that. But I think being able to offer that and having that as an option is obviously a really, it's a good idea in general. Again, this is a tough situation. If you can provide a benefit to an employee that helps them get through this and help you to retain them, that's key. Again, retention of talent is probably one of the biggest problems we see out there in the marketplace right now, other than COVID. These are probably the big two that I think almost everybody is dealing with. So anything you can do to help retain those people, that's great. What we're seeing though, based on the April 1st date for the ARPA plan to be able to continue that through September, is that the plan did in fact reset. So in the past, if employees had used up some time or used up all their time under those benefit programs, they were done. It's kind of like FMLA, right? You have X amount of time to use within a calendar year or a rolling year. And once that time was gone, it was gone. There was no additional benefit beyond that. If you were continuing to participate in those programs effective April 1st, everybody reset back to zero. So kind of like everybody running out of vacation time at the end of the year, everybody just got their new bank of time. And I know a lot of employers were kind of weighing, well, am I going to have an exodus either in the spring or summer of people who became sick or all got vaccinated at the same time? Again, I think your mileage will vary based on your workforce. I think for the most part, we've seen people using this pretty responsibly. As with any kind of benefit program where there's potentially free money for sitting at home, there's always going to be some abuse. That is going to happen. And I think what you really need to look at is the bigger picture of, is this helping the employees that should really help? And can you deal with somebody who might be abusing the program individually? Don't cut off all the good folks for that one bad apple who's in the bunch. So you really do want to make sure you're thinking about that. And that time can be used to incent employees to be paid to go get vaccinated. So if it's during the day and it's hard for them to get there, they can take that time during the day, get paid for that time. That money can then be charged off to the tax credits, et cetera. If they have an adverse reaction, either from the first or second dose or just from the one dose, if they're getting the Johnson & Johnson vaccine, again, they would have the option to take time off and use those tax credits to help cover that. So I think, again, from an operational standpoint, if it works for you, then it's great. I think, again, as a best practice, we think it's a great idea to offer that and have that benefit available for your folks. Number 10, we've made it to number 10. So employees off due to COVID-19. I do not participate in those benefit programs. I said, yep, I felt abuse or felt like we just really need to get back to normal. We're not going to be participating. They've used all their PTO time. Now what do I do? Well, you can always extend unpaid time Again, this is one of those situations where you're looking at a talent and retention situation. Unpaid time might be warranted in these kind of situations. If the person themselves is ill or they're taking care of somebody who's ill, and especially if it's due to somebody who's ill long-term. We do have some of these folks, so what they would call long-term COVID situations where there have been, and I actually have somebody like that who's in my family that's been dealing with that. It can be a while. They can be a caregiving kind of situation. And once you get into those situations, potentially it's an FMLA situation, depending on the number of employees you have. This person might be eligible for family medical leave to be able to take time to help with that person if it's somebody in their household, or even if it's themselves. Again, it's unpaid time, but it would be protected unpaid time where benefits would continue, again, if your organization is eligible. Also, under the Americans with Disabilities Act, one of the reasonable accommodations for somebody who's suffering from a disability, and most people who have COVID and have a serious case of COVID would generally fall under the disabled category, would potentially be time off away from work to recover. Again, there's really no timeline on that. It has to be a reasonable accommodation for the organization. And again, that's where you get into these gray terms that lawyers love to create in these laws, because what it does is create business for them. What is reasonable? The key thought is that you do not want a jury determining what's reasonable for you, right? So you really, again, need to be thinking smart about what this means within your community, what would be smart and what would be the right thing to do. And I think when you look at it from a PR standpoint, from an internal morale standpoint, how do you want your crew within your organization to be thinking about you? Because they all know. They all talk, whether somebody's off or in work or out of work. Quite honestly, they might communicate more when they're outside of work electronically than what they do when they're in the workplace, just because they have the means and ability to do it now. So again, the option is there to do it as unpaid time, to continue the time off. Could you say, well, geez, they haven't been here for 3 days, they're termed? I consider that a voluntary termination. Well, if you know the reason they're off again, and it's because of a sickness or illness, you want to make sure you're taking a look at those other options they might have to maintain their employment. All right, and additional questions. So Jen, as we've been chatting here, any additional chatter going on in the chat box?
All right, there we go. From the topic we just came off on the FFCRA and the ARPA, at what point can a manufacturer say they've had two individuals leave, have to be separated from work because they have COVID? At what point can a manufacturer raise their hand and say, I want to be part of FFCRA and ARPA? Can they enter at any time, or has the window passed?
Well, it was a mandated benefit for any employer with 500 or fewer employees in the past. Employers under 50 employees could exempt themselves in the past, but quite honestly, it was pretty tough to do, to be able to justify it. Now, if in your head you justified it and said, I'm not participating, that might not actually be legal. There's truly a really pretty stringent process you'd have to go through for those under 50 employers to say, I'm not providing this benefit, I can't afford to do it. Even though there's that time delay in the pay and maybe getting those tax credits back, it seems like the process is pretty automated now. Those tax credits tend to come back either directly based on a reduction of your ongoing taxes, or a direct credit back through the IRS. So the time points, again, it was mandatory up through the end of the year, through 12/30 of 2020. It was then voluntary from January 1st through the end of March, and again voluntary moving forward from April. So at each of those points, you would really have made the decision at that time, am I in or am I out? Now, from April 1st moving forward, again, if you haven't had any cases, and now you've got your first one coming up, and maybe you hadn't really thought, well, I didn't make that decision yet. Well, what you've made now will be your past practice. So if you're moving into it now and saying, yes, I'm going to grant this benefit, I'm going to provide this person the benefits based on the schedule, based on the reason they're off. And again, the reasoning can be for themselves being sick, or somebody in their household, or childcare issues, et cetera. Those things are all different. There's different schedules and amount of benefit people are eligible for under those benefits. If you're doing that going forward, then you're doing it going forward. You're kind of signing up for that program through the end of September of this year. So you can still make that decision even if you haven't had a case or had payments in the past. Just because it hasn't been utilized doesn't mean you can't participate. It's available to all employers that are out there.
So a question just came in, so I'm going to surface that one right now. I thought since the COVID vaccine is not approved by the FDA. It can't be mandated, although it was approved for emergency use.
Yeah, it can be mandated, but again, what we're really seeing based on the discriminatory reasoning and a process that you need to go through on both the ADA and religious, we're generally seeing most people highly recommending it and encouraging it within the workplace, but it could be mandated. Even hospitals, et cetera, there are some that have said, yes, we're mandating it, just like we mandate flu shots every year, just like we mandate pneumonia shots every year, et cetera. But even those organizations have processes in place because there are some people who are going to refuse it for the reasons stated and go through that interactive process with them. So it does create, quite a bit of work potentially if you do mandate it. But under the emergency rules right now, MIOSHA, the EEOC, and the Department of Labor have all said, at this point, employers can certainly mandate the vaccine if they want to.
Jennifer, I would kind of just add on this. This is why when we were going through this internally and talking about the decision, because we happen to be in quite tight employment relationships with all of our clients, and so we take on a lot of liability ourselves, is we've really thought long and hard about it and not making a choice of not making it mandatory. And there's a lot of things, John went through a lot of the items that you have to think about making it mandatory. You can, but we have made the suggestion and the recommendation to all of our clients that it is not mandatory. You can highly encourage, as John said, give time off for people, get them to do it, educate them about it, etc. But making it mandatory does bring it into a little bit different of a risk area. So
we had two questions focused in on this one next question, and that is, what is the best way to contact trace when you know you have a positive COVID case without breaking HIPAA? In other words, a person gets COVID and you need to inform those that they were around that they need to quarantine or they need to go get tested. Could you talk a little bit about the best way for a manufacturer to contact trace, but also comply with HIPAA?
Yeah, absolutely. And this almost goes back to the kind of the Facebook example, quite honestly. Before you even start doing the contract tracing, most of the people who have been involved in this probably already know something's going on. But ultimately, if somebody tests positive, you get that call from John, employee on third shift or whatever it may be. Hey, wasn't feeling great. I went and got tested. It just came back and I'm positive. And John was here yesterday on third shift and, around other folks. At that point, the key steps to be taking is talk with John. Say, John, who were you in close contact with yesterday? And again, the close contact rules are there on the CDC website. Basically, it's extended exposure of 15 minutes or more, or up to 15 minutes of exposure in intermediate steps. So even if people were going apart, coming together, going apart, coming together, that could be extended contact. So two different variables there. Based on the information John provides you, hey, here's the people I was in close contact with. You then need to talk with those individuals, ideally in person, one-on-one, or over the phone, depending on what you can do. Again, masked, 6 feet apart, ideally. And this is where some of the vaccine pieces now start to kick in as well. If somebody's been fully vaccinated, at that point, they don't have to be notified. Now, and again, in a small group, in a small employer, might you want to tell them that they've been potentially in close contact? It's not a bad idea. You're not required to, though. If somebody has not been vaccinated, again, you know this because you've asked, or just, small chit chat, a lot of times people know, you would definitely want to let them know. To the privacy piece, now, again, you can't tell them who the person was they were in close contact with. Again, we're dealing primarily with smaller groups here, smaller employers. Everybody already knows. They probably found out before you did. And they might have been the one coming to you and asking questions and saying, hey, I heard John tested positive last night. He and I were, hanging around the water cooler last night, or took a smoke break together out back. What do I need to do? Again, you need to manage those kind of situations, as carefully as you can. I think the key thing I always tell people is, if they know, just make sure they don't know from you. Just really want to make sure that information did not come from you. Even if they're telling you more information than what you already knew about it, you don't want to go, yeah, I know, you don't want to confirm rumors. You don't want to confirm other information. You just need to say, listen, this is all I can tell you in this situation. But they've been in close contact, and then go through that CDC checklist of, what are the things they need to do based on either isolation or quarantine rules, if they want to get tested themselves, etc. There's a nice process laid out there by the CDC on how to work through that.
So I can see where
Yeah.
this,
Sorry, Jen, I would add one other thing. I've seen this happen too, is if you, to limit the amount of people who actually are delivering the message and doing the contact tracing. Sometimes there are too many hands in the pot, and that causes lots of confusion. So I would designate one person, whether that's your HR person or somebody in the organization. If that happens, have them go to them, and that person's the one who goes out and delivers that message. And so be really clear with your leadership team and your supervisors, team leads, etc. It's not their role to be doing that. It's not their role to be informing other people. In fact, you need them not to be doing that. You need them to get it to the designated person internally that's going to do it, and let that person go and do their job.
yeah, that's a great recommendation too, Kelly. So this next question, I can see where it certainly, applies to all small business, but especially manufacturers, because there's so many workforce challenges with manufacturers. Can employers require an employee to get a rapid test? And can the employer pay for it? So in some communities, it takes, 3 days to get, the response back from a COVID test. But if you pay for a rapid test, you get that back a lot sooner. So can an employer require an employee to get a rapid test, and can the employer pay for it?
Again, this is going to be the lawyerly answer, and I'm not one, is it does depend. Part of the depends on that is, are you providing them time off under the FFCRA? If so, you need to be able to substantiate why you're letting somebody off and why you're asking for that tax credit. Now, again, is there going to be, a large worldwide audit of this somewhere down the road? Probably not. But unfortunately, if somebody does pull your tag at some point in the next 7 years, and they come back and they go, oh, look, there in 2021, you charged off, some payroll to the FFCRA tax credit. Can you show us the documentation that substantiates that pay? This is where the documentation comes in. You need to have some sort of documentation from your employee on why they were off. So either a note from the health department, a note from a doctor, a positive test. A positive test is the number one piece of documentation you can use in these situations. And absolutely, especially as the employer, regular testing is free, but as Jen, you noted, the timeline for getting those done is not the kind of way we move as employers most of the time. So if you're willing to pay for that rapid test and have them go do that, absolutely you can do that. Again, they need to be tested. That's really part of the documentation trail, and also helps them get back to work if they can. So you could absolutely, pay for that and make sure, hopefully, that they can get back to work a little sooner.
So this question, and I'm just going to read it. It's titled Example. Mm-hmm. Someone tested positive. They quarantined for 14 days, got tested on the 15th day, and still tested positive. What are the next steps?
Okay. Yeah, at that point, you're really almost starting the clock based on the date of the positive test. Because if the test is coming back positive on that 14th day, assuming they didn't get tested before that, a new clock really starts on that 14th day for an additional quarantine period. Again, and that's one of the things that changed here recently as well, with the isolation and quarantine rules. We had that 10-day window here recently that we could use. And during that time period, if somebody tested negative, after that day 7, they could return between that 7th and 10th day. Michigan Department of Health and Human Services moved that back to that 14-day standard. And under the 14-day standard, there's really no early test. So you can't test out, as I like to think of it, out of that COVID leave now under the 14-day rule. They really are supposed to be off for 14 days. And so if, even coming up to that 14th day, I said, if you apply the 10-day rule to the 14-day rule, again, always be careful if you try to apply common sense to any kind of labor law situation, because usually it's very counterintuitive. If you try to say, well, geez, if they've been off for 11 days and they test negative at that point, can I bring them back on day 12? Assuming they've got a negative test. Under the current rules, officially, no. There's no allowance for that, even though it makes sense based on the 10-day rule. Again, that would go into what I would call Kelly's risk bucket of what's the risk or reward of having them come back early versus having them stay off for those extra 3 days. Again, you probably feel pretty good after 11 days if there's a negative test of that person returning to work, but understanding that the guidelines say 14. But if somebody is having if they've been off for 14, if they had symptoms or for whatever reason went off work and on day 14, they didn't get tested until day 14 and it comes back positive at that time, then the clock really starts then on another 14-day round, unless something changes with those rules through the Michigan Department of Health and Human Services. They come back down to that 10-day rule at some point. If we get over this hump, then you might have some options. But as of today, where we sit today, it would be another 14-day round.
I'd like to ask just one more question that came in, and then unless there are other questions, we'll close up, and thank you for the time. But the question specifically is, can employers ask for proof of vaccination? And probably a bigger question is proof of COVID. So I'm a manufacturing owner, and I have someone come to me and they say I have, or email me and say I have COVID, and now they get 2 weeks off. Is there any documentation that employers can ask for, either for the vaccination or for that they actually have COVID?
Yes, for both, and also it does depend. So let's start with the vaccination question. If you're doing some sort of incentive program, if you're paying people, even if it's through the FFCRA, to go get vaccinated and for time off to recover from a vaccination, you need to receive some sort of documentation to substantiate that time off. So again, getting record of that vaccination actually happening is your documentation for the FFCRA or ARPA, whichever acronym you want to use, for your tax credit, assuming you're using that program. Even if you're not using that program specifically and you're just like, I'm not participating, but I'll still just pay. I'm just going to pay their hourly rate, whatever their rate is, to go get vaccinated. If they need to take a couple hours, I'm going to do that. You would want to, again, substantiate that for your own records. Because again, they're off-site, they're off-premise, they're not doing the work, but you're paying them anyway. You would want to have some documentation that actually got done. Even again, for if you were giving out company water bottles, that de minimis incentive, you would want to see some documentation saying that, yes, I did actually get this done. Again, part of it's for tracking, part of it does, again, downstream influence contact tracing. And quite honestly, under new rules that come out either from the federal government or MIOSHA, knowing who's vaccinated or not may change how people get treated in the future under some of these programs, under quarantine and isolation rules, et cetera. So knowing that really becomes, a part of work documentation going forward. So that's for the vaccination piece. For the actual leave of absence as well, I would say yes. Again, documentation for that reason to be off. Again, especially in the early days of the pandemic, it was quite honestly almost any documentation you could get. If you did a virtual visit with a doctor, show us that you actually got on a virtual visit with a doctor, and we'll probably take that for now. And then as testing became more and more available, we really started to shift to, let's see that you got tested, then let's see the results when they come through. Again, you really want to have that substantiation for two reasons. One, if you are using, again, tax credits to help cover the cost of that person being off, you need to have some substantiation for the reason you're taking those tax credits. And then the B part of it is, do you need to do some contact tracing? Are there steps you need to take within your organization to protect the rest of your team, or potentially send other people out to get tested as well? So those things, impact both of those areas fairly equally.
Okay, so we had 2 questions that just came in. I'm gonna, do you want to answer those questions now, John and Kelly, or we can respond to those questions and send the responses to those questions back out via email when I send out the recording?
I've got time right now if we want to try to get those in.
Okay, our participants are still engaged and listening. So let's just answer then those 2 questions. Thank you for having the time to dive into.
We are also, Jen, offering to, if after this you have specific questions that you want to call John, we're offering 30 minutes free. On the slide deck that we'll send out, there's a form that you fill out and that type of thing. So
Okay.
We'll answer anything that we can, but John, why don't you do these couple quick?
Yeah, absolutely.
So quick, let's see. What do you do if an admin employee travels out of the state for vaccination and tests positive upon return? Can the employer require the employee to use PTO? This is getting specific.
Yeah, so really, regardless of the reason they came back positive, if you're participating in FFCRA benefits, you cannot require PTO to be used before an FFCRA benefit. That is actually part of what was passed in that FFCRA benefit law to provide those benefits. So the employee actually has the choice. They could get paid just their straight PTO time, or they can use FFCRA if you're participating. But it's the employee's choice, and you actually, as an employer, can't incent them one way or the other, or make them choose one or the other. It's up to the employee to decide what they want to do with that time. So, kind of, regardless of the reason of how they came back with a positive, what horrible luck, I suppose, if you're going to get vaccinated and you come back from getting vaccinated with a positive test. But yeah, regardless of the reason, they would be eligible for FFCRA if you're participating. If not, again, then it goes back to do they have paid time off they can use to take that time?
Okay. Last question, and anything else that comes in, we'll send out via email. The question is, if someone is in the 2-week waiting period after their second vaccine, can that be used to shorten their quarantine period?
It cannot. No. Right now, the guidelines are that they do need to be past that 2-week period to be considered vaccinated. So even if that second shot has been applied, even if we're within 12, 13 days, they're not considered fully vaccinated until they get past that 14th day. So yeah, if you're doing contact tracing, you would still need to pull them into the loop on that. And then that way they can make a decision whether they feel they need to isolate, quarantine, or if they feel they want to go get tested. Again, really up to the employee then at that point what they want to do.
Okay, Kelly, do you want to, thank you so much, John, for all that knowledge and insight for you too, Kelly. Really appreciate the insight. Do you want to close this out and we'll
Yeah, I just want to really thank everybody for the interactive session. I hope everyone found some value of it. Thank you, John. Again, he's our #1 HR expert here. So we really appreciate him answering all these questions. And again, if you do have any questions, we're offering some free time of John, and we'll get back to you as soon as possible. So thank you for your time. We really appreciate it.
Yeah, and thank you to, again, Kelly and John for being partners with MGA, being a resource, caring about small business, and providing all this knowledge and insight for our manufacturers in Michigan. Again, this recording will be sent out to those who are registered, and we'll even go even broader to manufacturers that have an interest in this topic. So thank you again, and hope you all have a wonderful afternoon and week.
Thank you.
Take care. Thank you.